Seminary for the invitation, and Father Edward Mazik for his many emails and helpful responses in the past weeks, and to the Benedictine community of St. Vincent for the invitation to be with you this evening. I think that black and white was the dress code and I didn't get the memo, so thank you all. And I also offer thanks to Lucine Maris and her husband for their gift to the University of Pittsburgh of the Maris Chair in Contemporary Catholic Studies. I've been so happy in that position. It has enabled me to teach the history of Catholicism in the Americas at Pitt, a state-related institution, and this is especially unusual now at a time when state universities are cutting humanities programs, including religious studies. I'm delighted that family members John and Margaret Maris are here this evening, and thank you to my Pittsburgh and Sewickley friends for making the trip tonight. So at this Benedictine college and monastery, I couldn't help but think about my own education with the Jesuits some years ago, whose motto is AMDG, for the greater glory of God. So in Jesuit schools, the goal of becoming men and women for others focuses on the purpose of education, enabling us to find God in all things and to live in service of others. The history of the Jesuits is a much shorter one than that of the Benedictines, and without getting sidetracked too much, let me just repeat a joke that Father Jim Martin tells in his book, The Jesuit Guide to Almost Everything, that suggests a particular feature of Jesuitism. A Dominican, Franciscan, and Jesuit arrive at the gates of heaven, where they see God seated on an enormous golden throne. God asks the Dominican, "Son of Saint Dominic, what do you believe?" The Dominican says, "I believe in God the Father, creator of heaven and earth." God asks the same of the Franciscan, who says, "I believe in your son Jesus, who came to work with the poor." God turns to the Jesuit and says, "Son of Ignatius, what do you believe?" The Jesuit answers, "I believe you are sitting in my chair." So I wondered, if we added a Benedictine to this joke, how would he answer God's question? So ora et labora, the Benedictine motto, means to pray and work. It's a very balanced motto, very community-oriented, and it connects prayer and work together. When I asked a Benedictine sister what the motto meant to her, she said, "It means we are blessedly normal." So that's probably a healthier response than, "I believe you are sitting in my chair." So I want to start with an image not of the obligatory St. Peter's in Rome, but of our first cathedral in America, the Baltimore Basilica, and if only to remind us that American Catholicism is different from Catholics and its history in Western Europe. And there are certain distinctive features of American Catholicism, not least of which is a constitutional protection of religious freedom and a lack of a feudal heritage with monarchs and landed gentry. Most important for the situation of Catholics in America, the Catholic Church was never the established church, as it had been in Europe. So American Catholics were underdogs in a Protestant-dominated nation for the first couple centuries of the United States. And you can see from the slide that it's a neoclassical basilica in Baltimore, and Benjamin Latrobe, who also was one of the architects of the Capitol, built it. So at this point, we kind of see Catholics in an effort to fit in for the current craze of classicism in the early 19th century, when every bank and every other structure was being built with these columns and a Greek temple portico outside of it. So to tonight's topic then. Does data reveal the future of the American Catholic Church? So first, a word on data. I'm a historian, not a statistician or a demographer. So this is something of a departure for me. I generally write about dead people, but I find that gathering numerical data about the living is quite helpful in trying to understand the contemporary Catholic Church and to imagine its future prospects in the United States and globally. So for my remarks tonight, I've drawn upon these three major data sources: the Pew Research Forum, the Center for Applied Research in the Apostolate, or CARA, and the National Opinion Research Center, the NORC. So let me briefly introduce them. The Pew Foundation seems to fund just about everything, from your public TV stations to all this research. They're based in Illinois, and it's a nonpartisan think tank whose job is to provide information based on polling and on surveys. They don't take sides or offer opinions, merely present data on many issues, not just religious ones. Part of its many affiliates include the Pew Research Center based in Washington, D.C., which does most of their religious research, and so are very useful to me. CARA is a nonprofit research center located at Georgetown University for social scientific research about the Catholic Church. It was established in 1964, so a venerable heritage. And it identifies three major facets of its mission. First, to increase the church's self-understandings. Next, to serve the applied research needs of church decision makers, and I understand that you've invoked or used the CARA researchers here for a time. And third, to advance scholarly research on religion. And the NORC at the University of Chicago is one of the largest independent social research organizations in the United States. It was established in 1941, and it has its headquarters in downtown Chicago, with offices in other locations throughout the United States. It has strong Catholic connections. From 1961 to 1968, its senior study director was Catholic sociologist Father Andrew Greeley. For the rest of Greeley's life, he remained a research associate there. Incidentally, in 2005, he published The Making of the Pope on the election of Joseph Ratzinger as Benedict XVI. I have to say, with all of this research going on all around the country at a nonstop pace, I keep wondering why I never get called to answer any of these survey questions, except by a man from India warning me that my computer warranty is about to expire. So I'm hoping someday one of these groups will call me to take my views. So taking some information from each of these three centers, the Census Bureau estimates that there are about 332 million persons in the United States as of last year, and 78% of them are 18 and older. So we are an older country than many. In 2015, the Pew Center released a massive report on the U.S. religious landscape involving all religious traditions. And the Pew study divided the American respondents into 5 age cohorts related to years of birth. You don't need to write these down for the quiz later, so I'll just go through them quickly. The greatest generation, those born before 1928. The silent generation, born 1928 to 1945. Baby boomers, born 1946 to 64. Generation X, born 1965 to 80. And millennials, born 1981 to 96. They didn't survey so-called Generation Z, people born after 1997. So most of my students not in this survey, to their very great dismay. So one of the striking findings from the Pew survey was that the fastest group of religious affiliations in the United States was non-affiliates, whom they called the nones, N-O-N-E-S. Persons who profess no religious identification with a particular denomination or institution. So who are these nones? According to Pew data, the nones are persons leaving Catholic and Protestant churches. Hence, the decline of Christian affiliation and the rise of the nones are related phenomena. Who are these departing Christians? Mostly white Catholics and Protestants in 2 different age cohorts. While some older Catholics have left the church, people 60 and older, nones come mostly from the younger 2 Pew cohorts, born since 1965. So they predict that if this trend continues, fewer than half of Americans will be Christians by the year 2070. There's also an optometry test as part of this, so you can crane your eyes and your neck to see these slides. So let's compare the Pew data with the CARA findings about Catholics. CARA likewise breaks things down into age cohorts. And the largest generation of Catholics currently are millennials, 19.8 million, followed by Generation X, 18.3 million, and then the baby boomers, 15.8 million. So a total of 33.7 million Catholic adults are married or widowed, 8.2 million are divorced or separated, and 15 million have never married, of which the majority are millennials, so younger people. Here's some more numbers from CARA's findings in this survey in 2023. About 22% of American adults identify as Catholic. And this figure is confirmed by both the General Social Survey, which has been conducted by the NORC for every 2 years since 1972, and various Gallup polls. So this estimate found that there's probably around 57 million Catholics in the United States. And if we assume that some of their children will have the same affiliation as their parents, we might expect that there are around 73 million Catholics in the country. So 73 million out of 332 million is that 22%. I was surprised to learn from CARA that the largest share of Catholics resides in the South, 29%, but not by much. So a quarter are in the Northeast, 24% in the West, and 22% in the Midwest. 53% are female and 47% male. 36% of Catholics identify as Hispanic or Latino. 39% are 55 or older. 55% are in a household that financially supports a parish. And 1 in 10 are involved in their parish other than just attending Mass. People describe themselves as somewhat involved, 24%, involved a little, 24%, and sadly, 42% not involved at all. So in terms of religious practice, you've probably observed yourself that Mass attendance has mostly returned to normal after COVID, with one exception. The survey asked respondents to rate their frequency of Mass attendance with that prior to the pandemic. And before COVID-19, 23% of Catholics attended weekly. By comparison, only 21% were attending this frequently now. So what information does our third center, the NORC, provide? Throughout the decades, Father Greeley's research team has often reached conclusions that offered different interpretations of Catholic life than what Catholics believed about themselves, and sometimes they busted myths that non-Catholics had believed about Catholics. So most recently, NORC has been tracking the phenomenon of what we call spiritual but not religious. And in 2022, it published data showing that nearly 1 in 3 Americans identifies as being spiritual rather than religious. So this is way up from the 18.5% 2 decades ago. So to get this information, NORC took data from the General Social Survey, the Fetzer Study of Spirituality, and the International Social Survey Program. So they had a robust group of 93,000 people they interviewed between 1998 and 2020. The NORC report concluded that Americans regard religion as more formal, structured, and organized, while spirituality is more informal and personal. Some people call it DIY religion, do-it-yourself religion. Some see the relative rise of spirituality as religion declines with less belonging to a religion and fewer attending religious services as consistent with generic secularization theory, which predicted that modernization would inevitably undermine a transcendent worldview. With spirituality outside of organized religion just a way station on that path to the secular. And others see the rise of spirituality as a transformation that's redefining how people understand and interact with the transcendent that will prove to be the dominant pattern for the future. So thus far, this brief statistical overview of recent work by 3 major data gatherers juxtaposes some interesting trends and countertrends. Catholics are nearly 1/4 of the American population, but more and more of them are departing institutional religion to adopt the moniker of spiritual. Hispanic Catholics likewise have become less Catholic and more unaffiliated. So more than 1/3 of US Catholics are Hispanic or Latino, but fewer of them are identifying as Catholic. There are more Catholic women than men, as I said, and the Catholic Church is strangely more populous in the South, a shift from the era of 19th and early 20th century immigration, which concentrated Catholics heavily in the cities of the Northeast and the Midwest. The youngest cohorts of Catholics are those most likely to be involved in environmental activism, getting their colleges and universities to divest from fossil fuels, and the group least interested in debates around what's been called pelvic theology, the seeming tendency of the church to focus on sexual behavior and identity to the exclusion of all else. So this turn away from church affiliation suggests we've seen already a downturn in parish participation and less investment in things that we might consider typically Catholic, such as knowledge of doctrine and the sacramental system. So I want to, for the rest of my remarks, think with you about 6 issues using survey data across these items that are significant in our time and have some data attached to them. They are the climate crisis, declining numbers of Catholics, declining vocations, the clergy sexual abuse crisis, changing church infrastructure and internal labor sources, ethnic and racial shifts in the Catholic population, and ideological and theological divisions. So if you were paying attention last week, there were climate crisis rallies around the globe on September 17th, 10 days ago. This one on the left was in London. You can see Big Ben in the background. And they always have these snazzy slogans. I like stand up with the Pope, stand up to fossil fuels, and so forth. And the one on the right is American young people at the climate march. I don't think this was New York, but another city. So I would say the climate crisis is the existential crisis of our time. And I've learned that the term crisis is preferred now, since climate change was a term promoted by a strategist in the George Bush administration to sound less alarming. But we are, in fact, in a crisis of global proportions. And awareness of that fact dates back decades, if not 250 years ago, when we first began burning fossil fuels. We are facing environmental catastrophe in a few short decades without making substantial changes to the way we live, namely burning fossil fuels and relying upon non-sustainable agriculture and industrial production. Catholics can feel good that Pope Francis has been an amazing leader in this regard since publishing Laudato Si', also known as Care for Our Common Home, in 2015. Part 2 of this document, as he just announced a few weeks ago, will be arriving soon. His document has generated lots of Care for Our Common Home guidebooks and parish groups and a Catholic Climate Covenant. The Catholic Climate Covenant, which is housed near the Franciscan Monastery in Washington, D.C., has partnered with dozens of Catholic organizations, including Caritas North America, Catholic Charities, Catholic Relief Services, the Leadership Conference of Women Religious, the National Catholic Education Association, Mary Knoll Brothers and Sisters, and so on. So if you've not heard of any of these institutions and they are only part of a big alphabet soup for you, without a presence in your parish or diocese, get moving. All of these organizations have websites now and robust links to mission statements and documents. Another challenging slide for you. So this is Pew data from April 22. And we can see that there's a very slim majority of Catholics who relate global warming to human actions, but more Catholics than evangelical Protestants do so. What does this survey data tell us about Catholic awareness of climate change from church settings? Despite the urgency of the issue, among those who attend services at least monthly, U.S. Catholics indicate that climate change is not discussed frequently at the pulpit. About 1 in 10, only 8%, say that there is a great deal or quite a bit of discussion on climate change in sermons, while 50% say there's either some or little discussion of it. And about 41% of regular mass goers say there's no discussion of climate change. So a majority of Catholics apparently do view the climate crisis as a serious problem, and the political correlations are made here in the bottom of the slide. The opinions and statistics regarding Republicans not really in tune with climate crisis, and Democrats very much alarmed about the climate crisis. So, are American bishops being climate conscious or avoiding the issue? A study last year by researchers at Creighton University reviewed 12,000 bishops' columns from 2014 to 2019. So this is 1 year before Pope Francis issued Laudato Si and 4 years after. And they found that less than 1%, or 93 of the public messages of bishops even mentioned climate change. In contrast, bishops addressed issues of religious freedom and abortion more than 1,500 times. So if you've not heard about climate crisis in your parish, which is now part of Catholic social teaching, consider the diocese where you live. Engage your own pastor. Start a Care for Our Common Home group. Why are church leaders not promoting this issue? Catholics should be 100% behind implementing practices for saving energy, achieving net zero emissions at Catholic church buildings, schools, and health centers, consuming less fossil fuels, choosing reusable items for parish events, even promoting green burials. I can tell you from experience, my mom and I tried to get our parish in Virginia to buy reusable items for parish picnics and such, and we hit upon the scheme of getting bamboo straws and silverware, and this proved to be so prohibitively expensive that we had to jettison the plan. So obviously there are a few kinks to be worked out before we can all go to net zero in our planning here. So on the positive side, concern for the environment has led Catholics to connect outward from their own tradition with a lot of interfaith groups. Some of these organizations include the Evangelical Environmental Network from 1992, the Climate Witness Network out of the Christian Reformed Church, and Young Evangelicals for Climate Action, founded in 2012. Across the Atlantic in Great Britain, Christian Climate Action, which has Catholic members, has mobilized in England, Scotland, Belgium, Netherlands, Germany, and Switzerland. They have pursued innovative tactics we could easily use here, such as climate pilgrimages, which highlight widespread public concern about the climate and call upon the government to stop oil and gas expansion. So the discipline in walking a pilgrimage often leads people to conclude at a Catholic historical site, a shrine, or a church. Catholic Climate Action also held protests at the COP26 meetings, at the headquarters of Shell Oil, and so on. So in the United States, I see these events well attended by Catholic sisters and young persons, themselves inspired by activists such as Greta Thunberg of Sweden. Catholic sisterhoods, which have historically been masters of frugal living, are, not surprisingly, busily developing eco-friendly convent missions and projects in the neighborhoods where they're located, such as community gardens. I think some of those women are here tonight. Men in religious life are doing likewise. Some orders, such as the Carmelites and the Franciscan Action Network, have generated lots of educational materials, such as a curriculum for high school students to help Catholic groups get started. Surveys have found that one of the ways Catholics stay connected to their local community is to read their diocesan newspaper. And I would like to see a survey about what percentage of them are addressing the climate crisis. I suspect very few. The share of adults who now read their diocesan publication has risen after the pandemic. Beforehand, about 3 in 4 did not read it. I put myself in that group. Now in 2023, 49% read it, with some reading it online, others in print, and others in both media. So even more widely read than diocesan publications are parish bulletins, the things we usually throw away after Mass on Sundays. 6 in 10 adults read their parish bulletins in the 3 months prior to being surveyed. And CARA has regularly found across the years that the most widely read type of publication that the Catholic Church produces are parish bulletins. A quarter had read theirs online, and an equal share read their print copy in 2023. This would be an ideal place to launch a more substantive discussion of the climate crisis and to advertise ways to contribute. Well, offsetting enthusiasm for fighting the climate crisis is my second bullet point, the decline of numbers of Catholics participating, in part measured by Mass attendance. So we have 2 different disaffected groups, 60s and older, and 30s and younger. So why disaffiliation? The COVID pandemic, of course, changed attendance habits. There is also anger at clergy for the sexual abuse crisis, which is ongoing. There's disaffection for church positions on particular issues, especially as regarding homosexuality and abortion. In terms of returning to live Mass, it turns out that about 25% of Roman Catholics now watch Mass online. So that very technology that allowed us to come together during the pandemic is also preventing people from coming back to live Mass. We shouldn't be so alarmed that it's only Catholics experience this problem. It's happening in most Protestant denominations as well. In a book about de-churching that was published a few weeks ago, the 2 authors found that the median Protestant congregation, which now stands at 65 people, is down from 137 2 decades ago. Mainline, they have left their denomination because they moved, 25%, or because they had other priorities, 15%, or did not fit in, 14%. Whereas Catholics, who are de-churched, said they did so because they had other priorities, 16%, or had different politics than others in their parish, 15%, or differed from the clergy, 15%. So the current pattern, I think, suggests that Catholics who follow news and hold strong opinions aren't going to return to the pews anytime soon. So we should really ask ourselves, why is parish life not as compelling as it was in the 1960s and 70s? COVID, clergy sexual abuse crisis, but also attempts by conservatives to roll back Vatican II's more participatory liturgy and ethos and to replace it with inflexible norms and rules and the old Father knows best mentality, which has had a chilling effect. But still another factor, very much related to middle-class life, is that Catholics, like other Americans, have access to a lot of other forms of belonging than the parish. These include the range of affiliation and activities, from nature clubs to book clubs to sports clubs to amateur theater to music performance, all of which absorb time in the evenings that may have formerly been devoted to church-related activities. Catholics in certain professions, such as medicine, the military, and law, don't have a lot of downtime in general. As Carrie Weber, executive editor at America Magazine, reports this week, quote, "I think a lot of people in this age bracket are overwhelmed by caring for children or parents or both. Some of these responsibilities cover essential things, and others include signing kids up for extracurriculars. When COVID hit, everybody had to cut back on the extracurriculars. And I think for a lot of people, church or parish life became another extracurricular of sorts. When it was time to go out into the world again, I think many people looked at what they were gaining from being part of a parish community and decided their investment of time was not worth the return. So I think this is one factor to put into the mix along with the alienation unrelated to COVID. So for some, it's church teaching they disagree with. For others, it's lackluster liturgies or the clergy sexual abuse crisis. Weber continued in her article, quote, "For a lot of people, the Catholic Church represents judgment of people they love, whether that's people who have divorced and remarried, LGBTQ Catholics, or women." She continues, "When you throw in the stories of abuse that continue to be released, I think a lot of people are eager to distance themselves from the institution, even if they find value in some of the spiritual practices." So this image was taken in August 2018 at the release of the Pennsylvania grand jury report on clergy sexual abuse. As for the 21 years since the discovery in 2002 of the criminal activities in the Archdiocese of Boston, media have often referred to this as a scandal. But I think just as global warming is not an accidental or temporary change to our planet, the clergy sexual abuse is not a scandal, it's a crisis, and it's global, with cases reported as early as the 1920s. A lot of my friends have faster access to the Vatican archives than I do, but they have been reporting things they found as early as 1919. So from the revelations in the Archdiocese of Boston to the present, tens of thousands of abuse cases have been reported. The Diocese of Pittsburgh received its bad report card in the AG's grand jury report in August 2018. And to date, I've only seen very few letters of apology, one from Bishop Zubik of Pittsburgh, one from the Bishop of Greensburg, about these consequences. So to me, and to most Catholics, I think, the breach of trust between priests and people has been the most damaging result. The secrecy at the chancery level, which acted outside the criminal and legal systems to protect predatory priests and the reputations of bishops while endangering the lives of thousands of children. The lack of humility at the top has meant that little has been done to dismantle clericalism in the church. Many lay Catholics have asked why they don't get the chance to review the actions of their bishop and offer opinions about his stewardship of their diocese. They point out that the mandated bishop's visit to the Pope every 5 years is really not enough to evaluate a bishop's performance. So we don't have data on the very subjective responses of victims in this matter, and those who were abused have had certain forums to air their grievances. There is a group called SNAP for the survivors of abuse, and the feeling of emotional exhaustion that many victims report is compounded, I think, by the failures of the previous Pope and his administration to act with integrity and transparency. I would point you towards a marvelous website called bishopaccountability.org, run by a friend of mine named Terry McKiernan in the Boston area, who's tried to collect all the news reports and information available nationwide from every diocese, and much of it is accessible to anyone in their Waltham, Massachusetts archive. As you might suspect, there is a correlation between mass attendance and the abuse crisis. So in December of 2019, 27% of Catholics surveyed by the Pew Forum said they had reduced mass attendance because of the abuse crisis. And even though this isn't the only reason folks have gone to Mass less frequently, it is a factor. And we should point out that Catholics aren't the only tradition charged with sexual abuse of minors and adults. The Southern Baptist Convention and the Jehovah's Witnesses, founded in Pittsburgh, are now facing their own reckoning with reports of sexual abuse by leaders. Even the ultra-Orthodox Jews of Brooklyn have had their reports. Okay. Finally, I think a slide where we can read the numbers. So my fourth bullet point was this question of the changing infrastructure of the church. So declining vocations mean a lot of things. I regard this as a labor issue as much as a vocations issue. So we can see that in 1965, the peak year for Catholic clergy and sisterhoods, the numbers are down by about half to 2022. Diocesan priests, a little less dramatic decline, and sisterhoods way down. Brothers as well, I think. So religious orders keep the church functioning as a sacramental system and witness to the Gospels. And one major contributor has been American sisterhoods. So with them, we see living examples of the teachings of Jesus. Catholic sisters who are often at the forefront of work for justice, peace, and care for creation lead schools, run soup kitchens, do environmental advocacy efforts, work as NGOs in anti-trafficking initiatives, take care of immigrants, and perform countless ministries in parishes and communities across the globe. So I feel that the shrinking numbers of American sisters will be have an alarming impact on the labor force, the underpaid or unpaid labor force inside the church. You may have seen the news story in May about the Sisters of Charity of New York, who voted to accept no new members in their community, announcing that their mission has been fulfilled. And this story of the dissolution of an order may become more common as aging sisterhoods don't receive new novices. So after peaking in 1965, there are now about 181,000 sisters in the United States and about 700,000 worldwide. By the 2040s, Cara and Pew predict, there will still be more than 10,000 sisters in the United States, but that will be only 10% of the numbers of 60 years ago. So this means fewer Catholic school teachers, nurses, doctors, social workers, hospital administrators, youth ministers, and so on. So what about clergy? A CARA study was quite interesting. They call it the Vocation Ministry Report. And they looked at dioceses of various sizes, Tier 1 to Tier 4, with Tier 4 being the smallest. And they found there, when you had a larger number of priests to parishioners, you had the most young men entering seminary. And the Midwest is one of the few places where rates of new seminarians are on the rise. And I learned at dinner that this seminary also is being graced with new vocations. But I found it fascinating that it was the connection between a low ratio or high ratio of priests to people that more seminarians entering said they were contacted directly by a priest or were supported by family members or other members in the community who urged them on to enter the priesthood. Let's see. There we go. So this same report looked at where there are new ordinands joining orders, and it looks like in the Midwest, the winner by 4 percentage points, more joining. The South and Northeast a little behind, and the West way behind. There are not only fewer Catholics in parts of the Mountain West, but also fewer churched people in general. So I think that the talking point from the report was that when you know people in your parish and you have a one-to-one, face-to-face relationship with them, this can help budding vocations. And it was kind of a warning against bishops who were constantly downsizing and merging parishes, that you create monstrously sized parishes out of formerly smaller parishes. That is not a great way to get to know people, right? People are coming to your parish once a month or even less. So. Lay women have also contributed, sorry, my slide's a little off here. Lay women have also contributed a lot as church volunteers. Charitable work done by organizations such as the National Council of Catholic Women, founded in 1921, have lasted a century, and by now are probably reaching their natural end. No younger women are joining NCCW. There aren't enough local dues flowing to the national office to fund its many programs. And the same effect, I think, is happening in parish life, where older Catholics, energized by Vatican II, perform much of the work of liturgical planning, care of the altar, flower arrangements, church interiors, ministries of lector, deacon, and Eucharistic minister. So again, if younger folks are not claiming a religious identity, who will perform these tasks of ministry and service? So this brings me to bullet point 5, ethnic and racial shifts in our country. So it's probably no surprise to you that the 19th and early 20th century immigrants that built cities like Pittsburgh are no longer new. Newest Roman Catholics are coming from Africa, the Caribbean, Central America, South Korea, and India. And they are often more conservative socially than American Catholics. So Latino Catholics, I'm making sure you're staying awake by showing a repeat slide. So you get extra points if you realized, I've seen that before. This is from the Pew Report of April of this year. 43% of adult Hispanics now identify as Catholic, whereas a mere 13 years ago it was 67%. Unaffiliated Hispanics, those who are now calling themselves nuns, have risen well to around 30%. And the number of Hispanic Protestants, which for some time in the 1980s was considered the great growth period for Hispanic churches, has remained pretty constant, around 15%. Black Catholics are only 4% of the adult Catholic population in the United States. And they reported when surveyed that they had to travel further to get to a parish, and they were more likely to leave the church than other groups, not because they didn't like Catholicism, but because they reported feeling that they didn't fit in their parish congregations. So I think in this slide we can see, Black Protestants attended worship in large numbers when they were 64% of the population, whereas for Catholics, the population was generally white and others were in the 20% category. So it was very difficult for Black Catholics to find some purchase in this world. Though I must say, with the arrival of the 1619 CERT project and recent work on the slaves sold by the Jesuits in 1838 out of the Woodstock community in Maryland, there's been a lot more attention to Black Catholicism and to the descendants of those communities, which has really been an eye-opening experience. In terms of the last bullet point I had, ideological and theological shifts, this is probably the largest topic, and I'm giving it the shortest time. According to Princeton sociologist Robert Wuthnow, in a widely read book called The Restructuring of American Religion, he says that religious life in America has changed fundamentally since the 1960s. Previously, your denomination would be aligned with your political attitudes. But after the 1960s, political divisions cut through religious traditions. So to give an example, Catholics who voted Democratic 80 to 90% of the time were now split nearly 50-50 and remained internally divided over numerous hot-button issues like abortion, gender rights, homosexuality, racial inequality. So Wuthnow says that two different camps emerged from this transformation that are still with us: religious conservatives and religious liberals. The former became tied mostly to the Republican Party, pro-defense spending, limited government, and opposed spending on social services. The liberal camp was more untidy, more fluid, and carries the weight of a lot of social issues, but likewise is no longer tied to a specific denominational affiliation. So one's denomination becomes less of a source of identity than it did in previous centuries. One of the things I found most shocking, I guess, in the new data is that fewer Catholics understand or believe in basic doctrinal issues in the Catholic tradition. So this was a poll about transubstantiation. Is Jesus Christ present in the Eucharist or not? And the Pew survey from 2019 yielded some pretty disappointing results. Nearly 69% of Catholics polled said that the bread and wine used in communion are merely symbols of the body and blood of Jesus Christ. 31% said they believed in transubstantiation or the real presence of Christ in the sacrament. Has the percentage of Catholics who know the church teaching real presence and who believe in it fallen really from 46% in 2011 to only 28% in 2019? That's a very dramatic downward shift. And has the percentage of those who were unaware of the church teaching altogether gone from 17% to only 2%? Let's see. So there's comparison of Pew data from 2011 and 2019. They have a lot of categories here, but basically the green wedge is people who are aware of church teaching and believe in the real presence, and the unaware has gotten much larger over the last 10 years, and the knowledgeable doubters have shrunk, or actually gotten larger as well. Aware of church teaching, does not believe in the real presence, okay. And people who are unaware of this altogether has shrunk to a smaller piece. So in terms of the things that Andrew Greeley and the NORC studied for years, one consistent finding of Greeley was that the one thing Catholics would never want to abandon or give up on is the Eucharist. That it's not only an important bonding element for people at Mass every week, but something they truly believed in. So I'm a little shocked to find that most recently this belief has seemingly diminished quite a bit. They don't, of course, give any reasons for this, so that's some things you can tell me, perhaps, or speculate about, but they have found this consistently in their polls. Okay. An allied finding of the Pew study was that Catholics who attended Mass weekly had a higher percentage of belief in transubstantiation. So I think just like what the studies of clergy entering ministry found, that that personal connection with fellow believers that reinforces your belief and community. Two areas where Catholic practice is not declining are frequency of prayers and belief in life after death. Kara found this out, that even disaffiliated Americans have increased their belief in life after death between 1970 and the present. And this is one of the few places where even younger Catholics show growth. 73% of Catholics 18 to 29 said they believed in life after death in the 1970s. But since the year 2000, 87% of Catholics of this age state that they believe in life after death. In fact, in the 2010s, Catholics aged 18 to 29 are more likely to believe in the afterlife than Catholics of any other age. Currently, Catholics in their 40s are the least likely to believe in life after death. And the other trend that is evident is that Catholics ages 60 and older have grown more confident that an afterlife exists since the 1970s. It's probably because we're just closer to it, I think. So, tracing some of these trends suggested by data and surveys leaves us with a lot of questions and challenges. Do they suggest any sources of renewal within the American Catholic community? What I would have hoped would emerge from Vatican II, already 60 years old, is the church of an educated laity. Where is the church of the laity? And where are the tools for the education of the laity? This, to me, is one of the major unfinished tasks of Vatican II. Consider how hard it has been for Pope Francis to mobilize the Synod of Bishops happening next week in Rome on the three themes of communion, participation, and mission. This synodal process, by the way, dates back to the mid-2nd century, so this is not a Francis innovation. His opponents don't want to concede any authority to lay people, when in fact, Catholic professionals have been acquiring advanced degrees in theology, canon law, church history, international relations, papal history for more than a century. Francis wants discussion to focus on how Catholics live and operate as a church together, not as a hierarchy of bishops and priests on top directing the laity how to conduct their lives. But, as he found, clericalism is alive and well. I was delighted to learn that Benedict XVI supported the co-responsibility of clergy and laity for the church. The Vatican II document that he commented on was Lumen Gentium, never fully implemented in his view, and also my own. The document insists that the role of the ordained is to serve the laity, and that the church as institution should not be reducible to a mere secular power structure. Pope Francis has taken up this thread with vigor in his Evangelii Gaudium, noting that all the baptized are agents of evangelization, of spreading the good news. Sometimes global change seems impossible. Witness all our debates on the climate crisis. But maybe if we think smaller, one innovation since Vatican II has been the growth of a variety of lay communities, by which I mean intentional groups that may suggest the shape of Catholicism in the future outside of parish life. Joiners believe that the hierarchy and clergy have not been good shepherds of late, and that fundamental change to the church must come from lay folk. As a bureaucracy, the church suffers all the problems of aging bureaucracies, trying to protect the brand above all, loss of touch with the original charism, the message of Jesus. And so this slide shows 4 newer lay communities that I've been made aware of, and I'll just talk about each one very briefly. Intentional Eucharistic communities are a good fit for Catholics who aren't completely happy with the church, but don't want to abandon its best elements, namely the Eucharist. There are more than 300 such communities around the world, not all of them liberal. The Lefebvrists and the Society of St. Pius X are ultra-conservative and are also IECs. But for other IECs, we can learn from their experimentation as laboratories of change. Secondly, the Sant'Egidio community was established in 1968 by a high school student in Italy, and it now works in 73 countries around the world, doing remarkable work. It cares for the poor, elderly, at-risk children, those with AIDS, but it also has a track record in negotiating peace agreements, for example, ending the civil war in Mozambique after 16 years of civil war. It's also been active in Guatemala, Algeria, and Kosovo. They have a common ritual, which is evening prayer together, and they also oppose the death penalty. The third group, Future Church, was founded in 1990 and is based in Lakewood, Ohio, not that far away, and it supports women's ordination and the advancement of feminist theology and an end to mandatory priestly celibacy. But I really liked its most current project, which is to pair the weekly lectionary readings with a young Catholic adult scholar and have them write commentaries for the group. So a terrific way to involve younger Catholics and also to learn from them. Let's see. And the final group, I just learned about recently, Catholics for Change in Our Church, is based in Pittsburgh. And it's responding to the need to transform the church in Pittsburgh by building up lay co-responsibility and supporting more transparency and accountability in church governments. So they sponsor different focus groups. You can join as many or as few as you wish on various topics, such as the one I'll have on the screen here is a focus group on clericalism, for example. And so they have opinion statements and people come and discuss, and they do a lot of reading. And I omitted my, whoops, back on, can't go back. Now how I've done it? Okay, never mind. So in addition to these lay communities, other smaller ways we might think of affecting change in the future would include using media, diocesan papers, and parish bulletins as more effective ways of communicating important news about ways to address things like the climate crisis. Similarly, at the diocesan level, smaller units seem to support a higher number of clergy vocations because people know each other face to face and have a reason to invite someone to enter a clerical vocation. Demographically, ethnic and racial groups that have been minorities in the church in the past will be present now in larger numbers. So more black and brown faces, more people speaking Spanish. A shift from the long-standing majority of Western and Central European Catholics who arrived as immigrants before 1924. Those white church members who remain in the Catholic Church will probably skew older, since many younger Catholics align themselves with the spiritual but not religious trend and are not yet active parish participants. So my final two dramatic slides, which I've totally ruined, were about the two big questions, saving the planet and salvaging the church. So cultural critics often attack do-it-yourself religion. But I wonder if the choice to be spiritual but not religious is not necessarily a bad thing. It at least asks us to confront the question of belief in our age. As Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor suggests, we should focus on the conditions of belief. What makes belief possible in our society? A lot of things mitigate against it. The shift to secularity, he says, implies a move from a society where belief in God is unchallenged and indeed unproblematic to one in which belief is understood to be one option among others and frequently not the easiest to embrace. That was a very powerful sentence for me. So he's suggesting that many Americans, find life self-sufficient as it is, with a focus on human goals and human flourishing, and they don't ask for more. Hence, spirituality without religions are satisfying options for many Americans, and it does relate to the decline in church membership numbers for existing Christian denominations. The limit to this worldview is, of course, that it assumes the principle of maximum benefit to my own self as the measure of how to act. And it really begs the question of our responsibilities to everyone else, a principle that Christians have traditionally embodied in the sacraments and in theological tradition. But without change to existing denominations, these faithful won't be lured back. So that is the basic tension. Without community, we are lost, but community can't be built by a nation of individuals, each pursuing their personal ethic. Nor can it be fostered in a church that is resistant to change. So I asked, can being spiritual but not religious offer a new way to construct a shared worldview across which Americans can improve our society? Because its members are mostly former Catholics and Protestants, as the Pew data showed, they don't leave behind their religious values from those traditions. And hence, we shouldn't imagine that they're suddenly starting from zero as spiritual but not religious. In fact, in all their statements and gatherings, we find a familiar language, an ethic of care for others, and the obligation to concern ourselves with those outside our own families. Geographically, according to the NORC, people who identify as spiritual but not religious is strongest in the large metropolitan areas and the two coastal regions of the country. The most spiritual adherents are in the Northeast, New England and the Mid-Atlantic, and in the West, Mountain and Pacific, and the lowest in the South and Midwest. Politically, you're not surprised to learn this, the spiritual but not religious camp is more prevalent among Democrats and liberals. So whereas in the 1950s, Jews and Catholics identified with their faith in order to avoid ethnic labels, now some Americans don't wish to be identified with a faith label that seems to them oppressive or outdated. What I think that our data is suggesting is that the alleged Judeo-Christian synthesis that operated since the 1950s is no longer a shared cultural paradigm, and that the tripartite model of an America made up of Jews, Catholics, and Protestants has shifted in the last 50 years, and that this binary style of being a progressive or conservative who is religious now cuts across Jewish, Catholic, and Protestant traditions. So many folks have weighed in on this topic, and I've read a fair amount of philosophers who have suggested that perhaps our new mode of virtue should lie in accommodating difference and not in insisting that we all have the same values and practices. But that's a whole other lecture. Thank you. The satisfaction, I guess, is coming mostly from American laity, whose impression that is. So they tell a narrative which culminates in the fact that he felt overwhelmed, essentially, by this caseload, and that's one reason for his retirement, that it was just too much to cope with at that point. But you're right, John Paul II did not deal with this adequately, but I don't know if Benedict did any better. I'd be happy to hear counter tales, but I don't have them at the tip of my tongue, so you're welcome. Unfortunate things we see historically is that given certain pressures after there's a revolutionary moment, whether it's sexual mores overturned or social mores overturned, that the Catholic Church responds by retrenching a lot. And I think that the people who work on the traditionalist side have so much media at their command and so many think tanks working for them to promote this idea that somehow the tradition, which is already a questionable category, right? It needs to be returned to. I won't disagree with you. I do think that orthodoxy-centered Catholics are growing by leaps and bounds, and I've got members of my own family who were practicing homeschooling, to my horror, because I feel that's an invasion and a scooping out of the public school system and even the parochial system. Which has got its own problems. But I do feel that returning to those sorts of things, because reverent liturgy is certainly not only the property of traditionalists. I've been at many reverent experimental liturgies in my life that I found much more life-giving than I often do in my parish, that we should think about how people get their information about these things and why they will fall back on a traditionalist mode instead of thinking what else is out there. So again, for an educated laity, what are the sources of information you have about why you're doing what you're doing? And I find that even in a lot of campus ministries, the fallback is to bring back old devotions. And I ask my students, why do you want to be a 17th century Catholic? What's the point of that, really? Very few of them have read the documents of Vatican II. So I feel that that's the big failure of the church generally, was the energy of Vatican II was not mobilized enough to produce that educated, thinking Catholic who doesn't simply think that practices of 1550 or 1740 are the way to move forward. But one of the things that interests me about studying the American Catholic Church is how much it was the underdog in a Protestant world, and how much the effort of defining yourself a Catholic was about showing Protestants who you were, that you were a real person, deserving of respect, had the same needs and desires they did, and so forth. And some people say that moment started to shift toward the Catholic side when John F. Kennedy was elected. Others say after Vatican II, when there was a wider opening towards the world and documents talking about relationships with the Jews and so forth. But what I find interesting is that I think this model of Protestantism eventually draws everything into its jaws, because I would say that Catholics who are pursuing that more conservative path now are acting just like evangelical Protestants. Right? They vote the same way, they're obsessed with the same issues, they're doing homeschooling, mothers are to stay at home and not work, and I feel like this is like giving in to the very thing you had defined yourself against all these centuries. But I do wonder about that, because a lot of the people that do the homeschooling movement are evangelicals, and they present this literature to Catholics who go, oh, this looks good, I'll do this for my kids, without thinking about what the source is and what's the point of this. So the notion that somehow the culture or the world is so evil that you have to separate yourself from it. It really bothers me. Why not deal with the world that is there, right? You can't constantly be fighting culture. You are part of culture. Culture shapes all of us, including our religion. So I guess I feel for those liberals who haven't been able to sustain that energy since the 70s, let's say. They saw a lot of failures in their own movements. The anti-war movements did not stop Vietnam. We've gone on to several more catastrophic wars since then. The anti-nuke movement has not stopped production of nuclear weapons. A lot of those things people sunk their energy into were essentially had modest successes. I would say that the conscientious objectors were a pretty remarkable group of protesters in American culture. When I was a kid, I remember driving around DC with my parents and saying to my dad, what are the Catonsville Nine? Because Free the Catonsville Nine was sprayed on the overpasses of the highways everywhere we drove. So a lot of that, those folks are aging, essentially. But I do feel that, again, sustaining that kind of help from clergy hierarchy, and not all bishops were on board with that. Those smaller scale movements that Catholics invested in often have a one-generation lifetime, and that's fine. A lot of smaller cult movements don't survive the original charismatic leader, right, such as the anti-war movement. But there are still people in groups like Pax Christi and so forth that are carrying on this fight. It takes a little digging to find what Catholic movements are out there doing this kind of, I think, grassroots work. And perhaps the overall message for lay people is that grassroots organizing is exhausting, right? It takes a lot of effort to do that kind of work. So again, if you're a middle-class person in a profession, you come home from work at 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock, see your kids, then what? Then I go to organize the masses, against the car companies or whatever. So it's a tough thing. How people spend their time is often a very selfish choice. I'm not saying it isn't, but that people had the energy and time to do that in the 60s and 70s was amazing to me. A lot of them were students, so they had more time, perhaps. But yeah, it's a sad thing. I mean, I guess I would put the blame squarely on the hierarchy for not promoting Vatican II vigorously, but on lay people also for not doing the work of providing ways to educate themselves about what the lengthy tradition of Catholicism is. I'm not trying to portray it as one thing, and you can probably tell my own predilections skew one way and not another. But, I'm aware it's a big tradition, it's a big tent. So, yeah, I find it both alarming and wonderful that you can put so much stuff out on the web at once and have it available to people instantly. So I remember I was giving a paper last year at the American Catholic Historical Association, and I see everybody in the audience going like this, and I'm like, what is going on? They're tweeting about my talk at the moment I'm giving it, and I thought at some point, don't narrate your life, live your life. You should be enjoying the moment while you're in it, not constantly turning it into a media event. So that to me is sort of a barrier that I see with my younger students, that they're constantly obsessed with turning the moment into an artifact on the web or in social media to get likes or to get attention or whatever. But it can be a great way to purvey real information. So, entire Catholic dictionaries and encyclopedias where they're available online. Not easy to read on a phone, for sure. But you can get a lot more information quickly than you could, when I was a college student or a grad student, which is amazing. There's been a lot of attention to certain Catholics using social media, like Bishop Barron, Word on Fire, and other things like that. But I don't pay much attention to them, tell you, I'd rather read a book. But there is that way to manipulate media and to do more with it. So I guess for young people who mobilize around topics like the climate crisis, this is the perfect way to spread information. Thank you for your comments.